The quiet that descended after Michelle's declaration wasn't merely an absence of sound. It was a crushing weight that carried the bitter taste of 3 decades spent in selfless devotion. We occupied the bright living room of my humble Seattle apartment, rain drumming its melancholy rhythm against the windows, a typical gray afternoon in the Pacific Northwest. My son David perched on the edge of my old velvet couch, eyes fixed on his phone's illuminated screen, while his wife Michelle absently stroked the fabric of her expensive skirt, her fingers adorned with diamonds my labor had indirectly purchased. That's when she turned to me, wearing a smile devoid of genuine warmth, and spoke words that crushed what remained of my maternal spirit, suggesting that at 68 I should embrace a simpler existence, content with having just enough to survive, because my season of wanting had supposedly ended. In that crystalline moment, as steam curled upward from the tea I'd carefully prepared for their visit, I made no protest and shed no tears. Instead, I reached into the deepest chamber of my heart and arrived at a decision that would demolish the comfortable life they'd constructed on my shoulders. I would terminate the automatic monthly payment of $9,000 that had transferred from my accounts into theirs without fail for 8 long years, and I would observe with clinical detachment as their version of just enough dissolved like morning fog under the sun. To grasp the sharp clarity of that instant, you must first understand the invisible decades of sacrifice that came before. I am Clara Jenkins, a woman who dedicated most of her years believing that maternal love was an endless reservoir from which children could draw until the well ran completely dry. 15 years have passed since I became a widow, left navigating a world that suddenly seemed overwhelming and financially hostile after my husband Robert died unexpectedly from cardiac failure. He was a decent man, though not wealthy, and his death bequeathed me crushing medical bills, a house desperately needing repairs, and a modest pension that felt laughably inadequate against rising costs. David was 27 then, freshly graduated with a law degree. He seemed uncertain how to apply, newly wed to Michelle, a woman who viewed existence as a series of social hierarchies to ascend. I didn't pause to consider my options. I plunged back into employment with an intensity that startled even myself. I scrubbed the luxurious homes of tech executives in Bellevue's hills, my joints protesting as I cleaned floors valued higher than my vehicle. I accepted sewing commissions until my vision blurred in the evening's dim light. I baked specialty breads and hawked them at weekend markets, standing for 12-hour stretches until my feet swelled and ached. I did this because motherhood comes with an unspoken mythology that we are perpetual safety nets, the silent machinery keeping families operational regardless of the toll on our own mechanisms. The financial assistance began modestly, $600 monthly to help cover rent on their cramped one-bedroom, while David searched for a firm matching his aspirations. But as years accumulated, $600 became $1,200, then $3,000, then $5,000. The more I provided, the more they appeared to require, or rather, the more they felt was rightfully theirs. The pivotal transformation occurred 6 years back when I inherited my mother's San Francisco property. The old Victorian sat in a neighborhood that had gentrified spectacularly. When my sister and I liquidated it, my portion approached $250,000. I could have retired then, relocated to some peaceful coastal town, and lived out my remaining years in tranquility. But I was foolish, blinded by misplaced obligation. I invested those funds with guidance from a skilled financial consultant named Marcus, and when the returns began materializing as steady income, I didn't preserve it for myself. I thought of David, of his daughter, my granddaughter Emma, and convinced myself they deserved freedom from the hardships I'd weathered. I established that automatic transfer, $9,000 on the first of every month, imagining I was purchasing their happiness when truthfully I was merely subsidizing their entitlement. They adapted to the affluence as though they'd earned it personally. Whatever sparse gratitude existed initially disappeared entirely, replaced by cold, unspoken demands for more. Michelle initiated the campaign 3 years ago to pressure me into selling my apartment, arguing with rehearsed concern that it represented excessive space for one person and that the proceeds could be better utilized for family investment opportunities. I understood her meaning. She wanted a grander house in a superior neighborhood, and my home stood as the final barrier to her ambition. For the first time, I experienced a flicker of resistance and declined. Michelle never truly pardoned that act of self-preservation. From that point forward, every Sunday visit became a minefield of subtle criticisms about my selfishness, about how my refusal created obstacles for David's financial strategies. Yet throughout it all, the $9,000 continued to part in my account like clockwork, a silent apology for my single act of defiance. But that rainy Sunday felt different. The atmosphere seemed thinner, the insults sharper. They'd arrived late without notice, and David had immediately checked my refrigerator for prepared food to take home. He wore a cashmere sweater I knew cost more than my monthly food budget, and Michelle carried an exotic leather handbag that screamed extravagance. As I served them tea and small cakes I'd spent the morning baking, neither glanced up from their devices. I mentioned with slight excitement that my niece Rebecca was marrying soon, and I planned to purchase a new dress for the celebration. Years had passed since I'd attended any formal occasion, and I wanted to feel, just for one evening, like more than an income source. Michelle's head jerked up, her expression mixing disbelief with genuine irritation. She questioned why I needed a new dress, suggesting no one would notice a woman my age anyway. Then came the devastating blow, the casual, cruel assertion that at my stage I should focus on basics, accepting the bare minimum so the real family members could flourish. David didn't even look up. He simply nodded in silent agreement, a gesture more painful than Michelle's actual words. The moment they departed, taking 2 large containers of my homemade stew and a dozen rolls, the apartment's silence felt physically oppressive. I stood in the kitchen, staring at dishes they hadn't bothered clearing, and I saw my existence for what it had become. I was a phantom in my own home, a living bank account expected to fade into the background until needed again. I walked to my small study, hands trembling not with sorrow but with a cold, white-hot rage that had simmered for a decade. I opened my laptop and accessed my banking portal. There it was, the scheduled transaction for the month's first day, the $9,000 that had become the lifeblood of their vanity. My cursor hovered over the cancellation button. I thought of David as a toddler, how he'd clutch my hand when darkness frightened him. For a fleeting second, the old maternal guilt surged. But then I remembered his silent nod as Michelle declared me irrelevant. I remembered my worn sweater cuffs and how I'd skip dentist appointments to ensure Emma had premium activities. I pressed the button. The screen requested confirmation, a final opportunity to remain a martyr. I clicked confirm with a sense of finality that felt like a bell's toll. The transfer was gone. The financial umbilical cord was severed. The following days brought a surreal mixture of terror and exhilaration. I anticipated crushing regret, the biological imperative to protect my offspring at any cost. Instead, I experienced a lightness I hadn't known since Robert lived. Wednesday morning, I sat at my kitchen table as sunlight finally broke through Seattle's clouds, and I retrieved every bank statement from the past 8 years. I needed to see the numbers, to quantify the cost of my invisibility. As I tallied them in an old leather notebook, the reality was staggering. $9,000 monthly for 96 months alone exceeded $860,000. But then there were the emergencies. $20,000 for the SUV down payment David needed for appearances. $15,000 for Michelle's cosmetic procedure. $12,000 for Emma's summer camp she never completed. When the final sum appeared in black ink, it stared back like a stranger. $1.24 million that was the price of my silence. That was the fortune I'd poured into a bottomless pit while I wore shoes with deteriorating soles and ate frozen meals to conserve electricity. The hallway mirror confronted me next. I saw Clara Jenkins, 68, with gray hair that hadn't seen a professional stylist in 3 years and skin like parchment from stress. I saw the deep worry lines bracketing my mouth and how my shoulders had begun hunching as though bearing an invisible burden. They hadn't just taken my money. They'd stolen my vitality and replaced it with a script declaring me finished. I telephoned a number I'd kept but never dared call, Sterling and Associates, specializing in estate planning and elder protection. I scheduled an appointment for Friday. Then I called Marcus. I needed a complete asset audit and wanted everything restructured. I was no longer interested in supporting legacies. I was interested in surviving the present. Thursday afternoon brought the first of many expected calls. Julian's voice sounded strained, asking if there'd been a technical glitch because the monthly transfer hadn't processed. I sat on my sofa gazing at the city skyline, feeling strangely calm. I told him there was no glitch. I'd simply decided to follow his advice, to be responsible with money and focus on the bare minimum for my own future. A long, jagged silence followed. I could almost hear his thoughts scrambling to manipulate the situation. He tried the health angle first, asking if I felt confused. When that failed, he pivoted to anger, accusing me of vindictiveness over a misunderstood dress comment. I told him if he wanted to talk, he could visit Saturday at 3, alone, without Michelle. He protested about being a united front, but I was firm. Saturday at 3 or not at all. I hung up before he could argue. Friday morning marked a turning point. Mr. Sterling and I reviewed the transfer history, extra expenses, and my current finances. He examined the numbers, then me, his expression somber. He explained I'd experienced financial exploitation all too common among the elderly, often perpetrated by loved ones. He helped me draft a new will. The previous version left everything to David. The new one disinherited David entirely. My assets would be placed in a protective trust for Emma, but she wouldn't access a single penny until age 25, and her parents could never serve as trustees or influence the funds. We established a power of attorney removing David's name, replacing him with my sister in Oregon. Walking out of that office, I felt complete. A legal fortress now surrounded my life. No one could touch me or my future without my explicit consent. From the lawyer's office, I went straight to Marcus. He'd been watching my principal erode for 18 months, unable to intervene but deeply concerned. He showed me the grim reality. If the $9,000 transfers had continued, I'd be entirely broke within 3 years. But with transfers stopped, my investments could recover. We reorganized the portfolio for high yield, low risk income. Between interest and my pension, I'd have nearly $7,000 monthly for myself, a fortune for a woman who'd been living on scraps. I requested a one-time withdrawal of $15,000. I wanted physical cash, a tangible reminder of reclaimed power. He handed me the check with a smile that felt like a blessing. The transformation began that afternoon. I visited a high-end downtown boutique where the air smelled of expensive perfume. I found the dress, not just any dress, but a deep sapphire gown that draped over my frame like a regal robe. I bought it without checking the price. I bought matching shoes and a clutch that felt like art. Then I went to a salon. I spent 4 hours watching the stylist transform my dull gray hair into shimmering silver with light-catching highlights. I had my nails done in soft, elegant rose. When I looked in the mirror at day's end, I didn't see a selfish old woman. I saw Clara Jenkins, a woman of substance and dignity, finally ready to live. Saturday at 3 arrived with stormfront inevitability. When the doorbell rang, I checked my reflection, noticing the new spark in my eyes, and opened the door. David stood there looking tired and frustrated. He entered, eyes scanning the room, likely seeking signs of instability. He sat on the sofa, and for the first time, I offered no refreshments. I sat across from him, the folder of financial documents on the table between us. I didn't wait for him to start. I laid out the 8-year reality. I showed him the total, $1.2 million. I showed him the bankruptcy projection if I'd continued supporting them. I told him about the new will in Emma's trust. His face went from pale to mottled red. He tried expected excuses, the mortgage, Michelle's expectations, social pressures. I stopped him mid-sentence. I told him his lifestyle was his responsibility, not mine. I reminded him of Michelle's words and his supporting silence. I told him I'd finally accepted the bare minimum of his presence and respect, and I'd no longer pay for the privilege of being ignored. The confrontation was brutal. He accused me of coldness, of being a bad mother choosing money over family. He tried using Emma as leverage, hinting I might not see my granddaughter as often. That was the final straw. I told him if he ever used Emma as a bargaining chip, I'd use my full legal resources to ensure he regretted it. Emma was the only reason I was leaving anything, but she'd be protected from his greed. When he finally realized the money was truly gone, his concerned facade evaporated, revealing a bitter, entitled man I barely recognized. He left in fury, the door slamming with frame-rattling force. I sat in the ensuing silence and didn't cry. I felt profound closure. The next morning I called Emma at university, her voice bright and uncorrupted by her parents' cynicism. I invited her to lunch at a quiet coastal restaurant. When she saw me, her jaw dropped. She didn't see the tired grandmother she knew. She saw a woman who looked alive. Over lunch, I was honest. I didn't bash her parents, but told the truth about my finances and my decision to stop support. I told her about the trust. Emma didn't ask for money or complain about her parents' sudden hardship. Instead, she reached across the table and took my hand, eyes glistening. She told me she'd been watching them use me for years, felt the shame of it, but didn't know how to stop it. She told me she was proud of me, that lunch was the most expensive meal I'd paid for in months, and it was worth every cent. It was the first time in a decade I felt like a human being in my own family's presence. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Michelle called, her voice dripping with forced sweetness that turned venomous when I refused to budge. She tried framing it as a misunderstanding. I told her words have consequences, and I was finally listening to hers. Then came threats. David and Michelle hired a lawyer who sent a certified letter claiming an implied support contract, and that my sudden withdrawal caused irreparable financial harm. They sued me for $200,000 in compensatory damages. I wasn't afraid. Mr. Sterling's team responded with a countersuit detailing 8 years of transfers far exceeding reasonable support expectations, along with evidence of disparaging treatment. When the case reached a judge's desk, it was dismissed with a stern warning about ethics. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, told David and Michelle that a parent's love is a gift, not a debt to collect in court. The fallout was predictable. David and Michelle sold their SUV, downsized to a smaller home in a less prestigious area. Michelle returned to work as a receptionist, a position she considered beneath her, while David took cases he'd previously deemed too small. They were finally living within their means, and they hated it. But for the first time, they were actually living rather than merely consuming. Emma stayed with me during spring break, away from her parents' tension and bitterness. We painted together, walked beaches, and talked about the future, a future built on merit and hard work, not on silent grandmother sacrifices. 8 months have passed since that Sunday. I recently attended Rebecca's wedding wearing my sapphire dress and silver hair that now feels like a crown. I danced until my feet tired, surrounded by people who saw me not for what I could provide, but for who I was. My apartment now fills with plants and the smell of fresh oil paints. I've discovered a passion for capturing Seattle's moody coastal beauty on canvas. I travel when I want, eat what I like, and no longer apologize for my existence. I still love David. He's my son, and that part will never fully die. But I no longer enable him. He calls occasionally now, his voice quieter, less demanding. We're rebuilding something, but it's on new ground, level and firm. The lesson I learned in life's twilight is one I hope resonates with every mother who's ever felt invisible. Our worth isn't currency to trade for our children's affection. True kindness requires boundaries, and true love requires respect. I stopped being a resource and started being a woman. In doing so, I didn't just save my bank account. I saved my soul. I learned to live with the bare minimum of pretense, guilt, and fear. And in that space where others' excess used to live, I found an abundance of peace that no amount of money could ever buy. I am Clara Jenkins. I am 68 years old, and I have never been more alive.